The fluorescent hum of the office kitchen was usually a comforting, mundane sound, a backdrop to lukewarm coffee and hurried lunches. But today, for Agnes Periwinkle, it was the soundtrack to an impending apocalypse. Her perfectly chilled, artisanal, Greek-style yogurt, the one with the single plump raspberry nestled on top like a tiny crimson jewel, was gone. Vanished. Erased from existence. And with it, Agnes's meticulously constructed composure shattered like cheap porcelain. Agnes Periwinkle was not a woman given to histrionics. In fact, her life was a testament to the power of meticulous planning and unwavering routine. Every Tuesday, without fail, she purchased her sacred yogurt from the organic market down the street. Every Wednesday, it was her midday repast, a moment of pure, unadulterated bliss in the otherwise relentless churn of data entry at Sterling & Finch, a firm whose name evoked an air of understated, yet formidable, financial acumen. Her desk, a monument to organization, was a testament to her personality. Pens were aligned with military precision, sticky notes adhered with geometric accuracy, and her inbox was a landscape of pristine, unread emails. Even her stapler seemed to possess an almost regal stillness. Agnes was, in short, a creature of order. And this act of culinary vandalism was a direct assault on the very foundations of her world. The discovery had been brutal. She'd opened the communal refrigerator, her fingers, usually steady, trembling slightly with anticipation of the creamy delight. Her gaze, sharp and accustomed to spotting the subtlest discrepancies in spreadsheets, scanned the shelves. There, nestled amongst the wilting lettuce of Brenda from accounting and the suspicious-looking Tupperware of Gary from IT, was a gaping void where her yogurt should have been. A void that echoed with the hollowness of betrayal. A small gasp escaped her lips, a sound so uncharacteristic that even the perpetually oblivious Kevin from marketing, who was currently wrestling with a stubborn vending machine, paused for a millisecond. Agnes's eyes, usually a placid shade of cornflower blue, widened, then narrowed with a ferocity that would have made a hawk blush. The raspberry. It was the raspberry that sealed the deal. She'd specifically chosen that yogurt because of the raspberry. It was the crowning glory, the pièce de résistance. And now, it was gone. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic, immediately began to process the evidence. Who had access to the refrigerator? Everyone. Who had motive? Anyone who craved her yogurt, a rare and exquisite commodity in the decidedly unartisanal world of Sterling & Finch. Who had opportunity? The entire office, during the hours of 9 to 5, and potentially the cleaning staff. But the cleaning staff was a remote possibility. They were professionals, their movement silent and unobtrusive. This felt personal. This felt like an inside job, a violation of the unwritten, yet fiercely enforced code of office etiquette. Agnes's heart began to pound, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. This wasn't just about yogurt. This was about respect. This was about the sanctity of personal property. This was about the very fabric of their shared professional ecosystem. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to regain her equilibrium. Panic was a messy, inefficient emotion, and Agnes Periwinkle abhorred inefficiency. She needed a plan. She needed to identify the perpetrator, and she needed to ensure that such a transgression would never, ever happen again. Her gaze swept across the office floor. The usual hum of low conversation and the clatter of keyboards seemed to mock her distress. Brenda was humming tunelessly, her face buried in a spreadsheet. Gary was muttering darkly at the vending machine, a half-eaten packet of crisps clinging to his chin. Kevin, having finally subdued the vending machine, was triumphantly extracting a brightly colored energy drink. No one seemed to notice her internal turmoil. They were all, in their own oblivious ways, complicit. Agnes's hand, still trembling, reached for her desk drawer. Inside, nestled amongst a collection of pristine paperclips and a spare pair of reading glasses, was a small, leather-bound notebook. This was her incident report journal. She'd started it years ago, a whimsical attempt to document the minor absurdities of office life. But lately, the entries had become more frequent, more detailed. The disappearance of her favorite pen, the mysteriously relocated communal biscuit tin, the persistent flickering of the overhead light in aisle 3. Today, however, this was no minor absurdity. This was a crime. She flipped open the journal to a fresh page, her pen poised. The blank space seemed to stare back at her, an empty canvas awaiting the brush strokes of justice. Date, October 26th. Time, approximately 12:30 p.m. Her handwriting, usually neat and precise, was a little shaky. Item stolen. 1-1 artisanal Greek-style yogurt, raspberry flavor, premium brand, purchased from the Daily Harvest Organic Market. She paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. She needed to be thorough. She needed to consider all angles. Location of theft: communal refrigerator, Sterling and Finch office kitchen. Her gaze drifted back to the refrigerator. It stood there, a gleaming monolith of stainless steel, now tainted with the memory of her missing yogurt. Suspects unknown. However, perpetrator must have possessed access to the communal refrigerator and a clear disregard for the property rights of colleagues. She chewed on the end of her pen, her mind racing. Who would do such a thing? Was it an act of desperation? A moment of weakness? Or was it something more sinister? A calculated act of sabotage, designed to destabilize her carefully ordered existence? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Sterling and Finch wasn't just an office. It was a microcosm of society. And like any society, it had its dark corners, its petty rivalries, its unspoken resentments, its hidden anxieties. Agnes was a firm believer in the power of institutions. When faced with a problem, one didn't simply wring one's hands. One sought out the appropriate channels. And for a crime of this magnitude, a crime that threatened the very fabric of their professional community, there was only one logical course of action. She stood up, her movement stiff but decisive. The office, for the first time that day, fell into a hushed silence as all eyes, or at least the eyes of those who were not engrossed in their screens, turned towards her. Agnes Periwinkle, the quiet, unassuming data entry clerk, was about to make a statement. Her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly steady, though a tremor of righteous indignation ran beneath its surface. I need to file a formal complaint. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I believe a crime has been committed. A ripple of confusion spread through the office. Brenda stopped humming. Gary looked up from his crisps, a crumb dislodging itself and landing on his tie. Kevin, mid-sip of his energy drink, froze, a startled expression on his face. Agnes took another deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the bewildered faces. Someone, she declared, her voice gaining strength. Someone has stolen my yogurt. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, a small, almost imperceptible snicker came from the back row, followed by a more robust laugh from Kevin. Brenda's eyes widened in disbelief. Gary choked on his crisps. Agnes's face flushed, but her resolve did not waver. This was not a laughing matter. This was serious. And, she continued, her voice ringing with authority, I am going to call the security service. The laughter died. The office collectively held its breath. The security service? For stolen yogurt? This was unprecedented. This was Agnes. Agnes Periwinkle, the guardian of order, the champion of justice, was about to unleash the full might of Sterling and Finch's security apparatus upon the perpetrator of the great yogurt heist. The office, a place usually defined by its predictable routines, was about to experience a seismic shift, and it all began with a single, missing raspberry. Agnes Periwinkle, her spine ramrod straight and her gaze fixed with an almost unnerving intensity on the blank space where her yogurt once resided, reached for her desk phone. The usual gentle hum of the office, a comforting, mundane sound that normally served as the soundtrack to her meticulously organized day, now felt like a discordant prelude to chaos. Her colleagues, Brenda from accounting and Gary from IT, exchanged bewildered glances. Kevin from marketing, who had been engrossed in dismantling a packet of crisps with a disarming lack of grace, paused for a millisecond, a stray crumb clinging to his chin, before returning to his snack with a soft crunch. Agnes's fingers, usually dancing across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, hovered over the speed dial. The number for Sterling and Finch's internal security department was etched not just into the phone's memory, but into the very fabric of her being. It was a line she had never dialed, a formidable gateway she hoped never to breach. Yet here she was. The violation was too profound, the breach too egregious. Her artisanal Greek yogurt, a crimson jewel nestled amongst the drab Tupperware and wilting produce of the communal refrigerator, was gone. And with it, a sliver of Agnes's carefully constructed world had been irrevocably fractured. "Agnes, are you sure about this?" Brenda's voice, usually a placid murmur, held a note of genuine concern, tinged with a healthy dose of amusement. She gestured vaguely towards the refrigerator, as if a stern look might somehow coax the missing yogurt back into existence. It's just yogurt." Agnes's jaw tightened. "Brenda." She enunciated each syllable with chilling precision. It was not just yogurt. It was a premium brand, sourced from a small, ethically minded dairy, and it was my midday repast. Its absence represents a direct assault on my unwavering routine, a disruption of my carefully curated sustenance, and frankly, an act of unmitigated barbarism. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "And I will not stand idly by while such transgressions go unaddressed." Gary, ever the pragmatist, adjusted his glasses. "But Agnes, who would even do that, and why? It's not like it was, I don't know, a solid gold yogurt." "The motivation is secondary to the act itself, Gary," Agnes replied, her voice gaining a steely edge. "The perpetrator must have possessed a clear disregard for property rights, a blatant disrespect for the unspoken yet fiercely enforced code of office etiquette. This was not an act of desperation, nor a moment of weakness. This was a calculated act of sabotage, a deliberate attempt to destabilize the equilibrium of our shared professional ecosystem." She took a deep, fortifying breath. "And I intend to find out who is responsible." With a decisive jab, she pressed the button. The dial tone, usually a neutral indicator, now seemed to thrum with an ominous energy. The office, which had been a low murmur of keyboard clicks and hushed conversations, gradually fell into an expectant, almost reverent silence. All eyes, or at least those not glued to computer screens, were now fixed on Agnes. Kevin had even ceased his crunching, his mouth agape, crisps forgotten. The call was answered with a crisp, professional voice that Agnes recognized as belonging to Sergeant Miller, a man whose reputation within Sterling and Finch was that of a stoic guardian of order, a veritable bulldog of corporate security. His usual purview involved misplaced access cards, suspicious server activity, and the occasional rogue printer jam. Yogurt theft, however, seemed to be a new frontier. "Sterling and Finch Security, Sergeant Miller speaking. How may I assist you?" Agnes cleared her throat, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. "Sergeant Miller, this is Agnes Periwinkle from Data Entry. I am reporting a serious infraction. A theft has occurred." There was a brief pause on the other end, a subtle shift in the sergeant's tone. "A theft, Ms. Periwinkle?" Can you specify the nature of the item stolen and its approximate value? Agnes felt a flicker of indignation. Approximate value? This was not a matter of monetary worth. It was a matter of principle. The item in question was a single-serving container of artisanal Greek yogurt, specifically the Raspberry Ripple Dream variety, purchased yesterday from the Wholesome Spoon Artisanal Market. Its true value, Sergeant, cannot be measured in mere currency. She paused, then added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "It was my lunch." Another pause. Longer this time. Agnes could almost visualize Sergeant Miller's brow furrowing in concentration, his finely tuned instrument of logic struggling to process the information. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant whir of the ventilation system. "Ms. Periwinkle," Sergeant Miller finally stated, his voice carefully neutral. "While we appreciate your diligence, our department typically handles more significant matters. Perhaps you could file a formal grievance with HR regarding the missing lunch?" Agnes's meticulously constructed composure threatened to fracture once more, but she held firm. HR dealt with inter-office squabbles and misplaced staplers. This was a crime, a personal violation. "Sergeant," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum, "this is not merely a case of a misplaced lunch. This is a deliberate act of culinary vandalism. It is a direct assault on the sanctity of personal property within this establishment. The implications are far-reaching. If such a blatant disregard for the rules is permitted to stand, what is to prevent further escalation? What is next? The pilfering of employee pens? The unauthorized use of company coffee mugs? The very fabric of our shared professional ecosystem is threatened." She could hear a faint rustling on the other end, a subtle shift in Sergeant Miller's posture, perhaps. The sheer, unadulterated earnestness in Agnes's voice, the almost biblical pronouncements of doom she was invoking over a yogurt, had clearly piqued his professional curiosity, or perhaps his sense of the absurd. "Culinary vandalism, you say?" Sergeant Miller's voice was now tinged with a hint of something Agnes couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't quite amusement, but it wasn't entirely dismissive either. "And you believe this was an inside job?" "Undoubtedly," Agnes declared without hesitation. "The cleaning crew operates on a strict schedule, and their access is limited to after hours. This occurred during business hours. Furthermore, the specific nature of the yogurt, its artisanal origin, its premium branding, suggests a perpetrator with a discerning palate, someone who would appreciate its unique qualities. This is not the act of a casual opportunist. This is personal." A low chuckle, quickly suppressed, could be heard from Sergeant Miller's end. "Very well, Ms. Periwinkle. I will dispatch an officer to your floor to take a formal statement. Please remain by your desk and do not disturb the scene of the crime. And Ms. Periwinkle?" "Yes, Sergeant?" "Try not to agitate yourself further. We'll get to the bottom of this." Agnes hung up the phone, her hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a surge of righteous indignation and a grim determination. She looked around at her colleagues, who were now openly staring. Kevin had abandoned his crisps entirely, his eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and concern. Brenda looked as though she wanted to offer Agnes a comforting pat on the shoulder, but was wisely refraining. Gary, ever the pragmatist, was already mentally cataloging the security protocols that might be involved. "An officer is on their way," Agnes announced, her voice now a beacon of resolve amidst the stunned silence. "We will cooperate fully, and then Sergeant Miller will ensure that justice is served. The great yogurt heist will not go unpunished." She straightened her blouse, smoothed down her skirt, and settled back into her chair, her gaze fixed on the office door. The fluorescent hum of the office lights seemed to intensify, the mundane sounds of the workday now a distant echo. Agnes Periwinkle was poised, a solitary figure in a sea of bewildered colleagues, ready to face the formidable might of Sterling and Finch's security apparatus. The perpetrator, whoever they were, had underestimated her. They had underestimated the ferocity with which she would defend her meticulously organized life, and the lengths to which she would go to reclaim her raspberry-kissed artisanal yogurt. The investigation had begun, and Agnes Periwinkle, champion of the sacred yogurt, was ready for battle. The blank space in the refrigerator was a gaping void, a testament to a crime that threatened the very foundations of her world, and she would not rest until it was filled, not with another yogurt, but with the satisfying closure of justice. The wheels of bureaucracy had been set in motion, and Agnes was confident that, with enough formal complaints, enough meticulous documentation, and enough unwavering resolve, even the most audacious of yogurt thieves would eventually be brought to account. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic, was already formulating the questions that would be posed, the alibis that would be scrutinized, the subtle discrepancies that would be unearthed. This was not just about yogurt. It was about the principle of the thing. It was about order. It was about justice. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The usual office chatter had subsided into a low, expectant hum. Every so often, someone would glance at Agnes, then at the door, a ripple of unease and morbid curiosity spreading through the floor. Gary from IT had even begun to discreetly search the company's intranet for the official Sterling and Finch Security Department protocol manual, a faint frown of concentration etched on his face. Brenda, meanwhile, was surreptitiously scrolling through her phone, likely researching the nutritional benefits of various yogurt brands, perhaps as a preemptive measure, should she be questioned. Kevin, however, had returned to his crisps, though his crunching was now more subdued, as if he were mindful of the gravity of the situation. Then the elevator doors chimed, a sound that, under normal circumstances, would have been lost in the general din. But today, it cut through the silence like a sharp blade. All heads turned. A figure emerged, clad in the crisp, dark uniform of Sterling and Finch Security. He was a man of imposing stature, with a stern, unsmiling face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Sergeant Miller, Agnes realized with a jolt of grim satisfaction. He was not alone. Beside him walked a younger officer, notebook in hand, pen poised. Sergeant Miller's gaze swept across the office, his eyes eventually landing on Agnes, who sat ramrod straight at her desk, her posture radiating an almost regal stillness. He approached her desk with measured, deliberate steps, the younger officer trailing behind, a silent observer. The office collectively held its breath. "Ms. Periwinkle?" Sergeant Miller's voice was a low rumble, devoid of any trace of the subtle amusement that had been present on the phone. This was business. Serious business. Agnes nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Sergeant, officer. I am Sergeant Miller, as you know. This is Officer Davies. We are here to take your formal statement regarding the incident." He gestured with his chin towards an empty chair beside Agnes's desk. "If you would be so kind as to recount the events as you remember them." Agnes took another deep breath, centering herself. This was it. The beginning of the official inquiry. She would present the facts, clearly and concisely. She would lay bare the details of the transgression. She would ensure that the perpetrator understood the gravity of their actions. "Of course, Sergeant," Agnes began, her voice steady and clear. "At approximately 12:37 p.m. this afternoon, I proceeded to the communal refrigerator located in the main break room for the purpose of retrieving my pre-portioned midday sustenance. Upon opening the refrigerator door, I discovered that my personal container of artisanal Greek yogurt, specifically the Raspberry Ripple Dream variety, was conspicuously absent from its designated location. The space where it had been meticulously placed yesterday evening was now empty. She paused, her eyes meeting Sergeant Miller's. This yogurt was not merely food, Sergeant. It was a symbol of order, a carefully chosen component of my daily regimen, and its theft represents a profound violation of my personal space and professional sanctuary. Officer Davies began scribbling furiously in his notebook, his pen scratching against the paper, a tiny, insistent sound in the otherwise hushed room. Sergeant Miller listened intently, his expression unreadable. "Can you describe the yogurt, Miss Periwinkle?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. "It was a standard 5.3-ounce serving," Agnes elaborated, her memory a pristine landscape of detail. The container was a clear plastic cup with a distinctive crimson lid bearing the Wholesome Spoon logo. The yogurt itself was a thick, creamy Greek style with visible swirls of raspberry puree throughout. It possessed a subtle, yet distinct tang, a testament to its artisanal craftsmanship. The absence of that specific flavor, that particular texture, was immediately apparent. It was a void that echoed with the hollowness of betrayal. Brenda from accounting, unable to contain herself any longer, let out a small, involuntary gasp. Kevin from marketing, meanwhile, was staring at Agnes with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Gary from IT had abandoned his intranet search and was now leaning forward, his elbows on his desk, hanging on every word. Sergeant Miller nodded slowly. "And you are certain of the time? 12:37 p.m.? "Precisely," Agnes confirmed. "My internal clock is exceptionally accurate, and I had just completed a rather demanding data analysis task that concluded at precisely 12:35 p.m. The immediate need for my yogurt was paramount." "Were there any other items missing from the refrigerator?" Officer Davies interjected, his voice younger and more eager than the sergeant's. Agnes considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Not that I observed. My immediate focus was, understandably, on the missing yogurt. However, I recall seeing Brenda's rather uninspiring quinoa salad and Gary's rather alarming collection of leftover Chinese takeout. But these are everyday occurrences, officer. The yogurt? The yogurt was unique." Sergeant Miller made a note. "And who else, to your knowledge, had access to the refrigerator around that time?" Agnes's gaze flickered towards Kevin from marketing, who was now nervously fiddling with his crisp packet. Then she looked at Brenda, who offered a weak, apologetic smile. Gary remained stoic, his focus unwavering. Several colleagues were present in the vicinity of the break room between 12:30 p.m. and 1 p.m. Kevin, as you can see, was engaged in his own culinary pursuits. Brenda was preparing her own lunch. Gary was likely fetching a beverage. The exact movements of each individual are, of course, unknown to me, but the opportunity was certainly present for any number of employees. Sergeant Miller stood up, his posture conveying a quiet authority. "Thank you, Ms. Periwinkle. Officer Davies and I will now conduct a preliminary sweep of the immediate area, including the break room and its surrounding environs. We will be interviewing other employees who were present in the break room during the suspected time frame. We will also be reviewing any available security footage from the hallway cameras that may have captured movement in and out of the break room." He looked directly at Agnes, his gaze steady. "This is a serious matter, Miss Periwinkle. We will treat it with the utmost professionalism and diligence. We will find your yogurt." Agnes Periwinkle nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile gracing her lips. Justice, she thought, was finally on its way. The meticulously constructed composure of Sterling and Finch had been shaken, but it would be restored, and the perpetrator, no matter how cunning, would learn that Agnes Periwinkle's yogurt was not to be trifled with. The hunt was on. Sergeant Miller, a man whose career had thus far been punctuated by the occasional pilfered stapler or misplaced memo, found himself staring at a security camera feed that offered little in the way of dramatic revelation. The office kitchen, a sterile expanse of stainless steel and linoleum, was a hive of mundane activity. People shuffled in and out, grabbing coffee, microwaving dubious leftovers, and engaging in the low-level hum of office chatter. Agnes Periwinkle's description of the yogurt, the crimson jewel nestled in its artisanal, glassine container, had painted a picture of a culinary masterpiece, a beacon of pure, unadulterated bliss. The reality, as captured by the unblinking eye of the camera, was a little less operatic. He zoomed in on the refrigerator, a gleaming monolith of stainless steel, now tainted with the memory of Agnes's profound distress. The timestamp showed Agnes placing the yogurt inside at precisely 8:47 a.m., a ritualistic act, no doubt, part of her unwavering routine. Then, nothing. For hours, the refrigerator door opened and closed with predictable regularity, revealing a rotating cast of characters and their equally predictable midday repasts. Gary from IT, his perpetually rumpled shirt a testament to his dedication to the digital realm, retrieved a Tupperware container of what appeared to be last night's questionable casserole. Brenda from accounting, her sensible cardigan a stark contrast to Agnes's more vibrant personal style, selected a prepackaged salad. Kevin from marketing, ever the embodiment of cheerful obliviousness, emerged with a half-eaten packet of crisps clinging to his chin, a veritable walking advertisement for his department's perceived lack of dietary discipline. Sergeant Miller sighed, the sound a quiet exhalation in the otherwise still confines of his office. He was not, by nature, a man prone to dramatic pronouncements or grand theories of corporate espionage. His world was one of demonstrable facts, of clear evidence and logical progression. Agnes Periwinkle, however, had presented him with a challenge that transcended the ordinary. Her conviction, the sheer ferocity with which she'd articulated the theft of her sacred yogurt, had lodged itself in his mind like a stubborn piece of lint. It wasn't just about the yogurt, it was about the violation, the disruption of an established order, the breach of an unwritten, yet fiercely enforced code of office etiquette. He replayed the footage again, this time focusing on the moments leading up to Agnes's discovery. Her return to the kitchen at 12:03 p.m., her hand reaching for the refrigerated prize, her subsequent stillness, a tableau of disbelief. Then, the subtle shift, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, the way her shoulders, usually held with a posture of quiet dignity, seemed to stiffen. The narrator's description of her meticulously constructed composure, shattering like cheap porcelain, felt, in retrospect, entirely accurate. The security footage offered no smoking gun, no shadowy figure lurking with ill intent. The theft, if it could even be called that, had occurred in broad daylight, amidst the casual comings and goings of a typical workday. It was an act of almost audacious normalcy, a testament to the perpetrator's apparent disregard for property rights, or perhaps more disturbingly, a clear understanding of the office's relaxed security protocols. Miller leaned back in his chair, the worn leather creaking in protest. He knew Agnes believed this was more than a simple act of petty theft. She had spoken of a calculated act of sabotage, of a desire to destabilize the very fabric of their shared professional ecosystem. While he found such pronouncements somewhat theatrical, he couldn't entirely dismiss them. In a microcosm of society like an office, where petty rivalries and unspoken resentments could fester in the dark corners, anything was possible. He decided to start with the most immediate suspects, the individuals whose proximity to the refrigerator at the critical juncture might warrant further inquiry. Gary from IT was a possibility, though his culinary choices suggested a man more interested in sustenance than gastronomic exploration. Brenda from accounting, while seemingly above such petty transgressions, possessed a formidable financial acumen that might, in theory, extend to a shrewd assessment of Agnes's yogurt-related vulnerabilities. And then there was Kevin from marketing, whose perpetual state of cheerful obliviousness made him both an unlikely culprit and therefore a surprisingly compelling one. A perpetrator who could steal Agnes's yogurt and remain utterly unaware of the seismic shift he had just caused in her world was, in a strange way, the most dangerous kind. Miller picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. He needed to speak to them, to gauge their reactions, to observe their demeanor. He needed to ask them, in his most neutral, professional tone, about their whereabouts, their lunch plans, and, of course, their thoughts on the missing artisanal Greek yogurt. It was a delicate dance, a subtle probing of the office's collective consciousness. He knew Agnes was expecting a swift and decisive resolution, a return to the predictable equilibrium of her ordered existence. He, however, was beginning to suspect that the resolution might be far more complex, far more revealing than Agnes Periwinkle could have ever imagined. He dialed Brenda from accounting's extension first. "Brenda, Sergeant Miller here. Sterling and Finch Security. I'm following up on a personnel matter. Could you spare a few minutes to answer some questions?" Brenda's voice, when it came through the receiver, was crisp and efficient, a sound as predictable and comforting as the ticking of the office clock. "Sergeant Miller, of course. I'm available immediately. Is everything all right?" "Just a routine inquiry, Brenda," Miller assured her, his gaze drifting back to the security footage. "Regarding the office refrigerator, did you happen to notice anything unusual this morning?" A brief pause, then Brenda's reply, delivered with the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to balancing ledgers. "Unusual? No, Sergeant, I can't say I did. The refrigerator is, as always, a rather chaotic environment. I try to keep my interactions with it to a minimum, focusing solely on the retrieval of my own pre-portioned meals." Miller scribbled a note on his pad. "And you didn't happen to see anyone interacting with Ms. Periwinkle's yogurt?" Another pause, slightly longer this time. "Ms. Periwinkle's yogurt? I'm afraid I wouldn't even know what Ms. Periwinkle's yogurt looks like, Sergeant. My focus is strictly on the fiscal irregularities, not the interpersonal culinary arrangements of my colleagues." Miller thanked her and hung up, a faint smile playing on his lips. Brenda was, as expected, a fortress of professional detachment. He moved on to Gary from IT. Gary's response was a rambling, technobabble-infused account of a server crash, a rogue firewall, and the general existential dread of being on call. He vaguely recalled seeing Agnes's yogurt, describing it as some kind of fancy dairy product, probably organic, judging by the price tag I imagine it had. He denied any involvement, his voice laced with the weary resignation of someone who had clearly dealt with more pressing technological crises than a missing yogurt. Finally, Miller called Kevin from marketing. He braced himself. Kevin's voice boomed through the receiver, a cheerful booming sound that seemed to vibrate with an almost aggressive optimism. "Sergeant Miller, what a surprise! To what do I owe the pleasure? Did someone finally figure out how to turn on the new espresso machine?" "No, Kevin," Miller said, his voice carefully modulated. "This is about Ms. Periwinkle's yogurt, the artisanal Greek yogurt that was in the office refrigerator this morning." Kevin's laughter, a hearty, unrestrained sound, filled the small office. "Agnes's yogurt! Oh, that's rich. Did she lose it? That woman's yogurt is practically legendary." "I've seen her guard it like it was the crown jewels." "It appears to have been misplaced," Miller said, choosing his words with care. "Did you happen to see it this morning, Kevin? Or perhaps notice anyone else near it?" Kevin's laughter subsided, replaced by a thoughtful hum. "Let me think. This morning, I was in and out, grabbing a Danish. Yeah, I saw Agnes's yogurt. Looked all fancy, like she always does. But who would steal Agnes's yogurt? That's like stealing her entire organizational system. It's practically a hate crime in this office." He paused, then added, wait a minute. Did Brenda from accounting look a little smug this morning? Like she just won the lottery, but for yogurt? Miller suppressed a sigh. Kevin, despite his apparent lack of focus, possessed a peculiar knack for misdirection and an uncanny ability to latch onto the most improbable theories. "Thank you, Kevin. That's all for now." He hung up, the weight of the investigation settling more heavily upon him. The security footage offered no conclusive evidence, and the initial interviews had yielded nothing but vague recollections and Kevin's outlandish speculation about Brenda. Agnes Periwinkle was convinced this was a deliberate act, a targeted strike against her carefully constructed world. But who would have the motive, and more importantly, the audacity, to commit such a transgression? He decided to review the office's internal communication logs. Perhaps there had been some disgruntled email, some passive-aggressive Slack message that, in hindsight, might offer a clue. He opened the Sterling and Finch internal network, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He navigated through the labyrinthine digital corridors, searching for any hint of discord, any whisper of discontent that might have escalated to a yogurt-related crime. The digital landscape was, as Agnes would have described, a monument to organization. Emails were meticulously filed, project folders were neatly categorized, and the chat logs were a testament to the efficient, if sometimes dry, exchange of information. Yet, as he scrolled through the messages, a pattern began to emerge, a subtle undercurrent of something. It wasn't outright animosity, but a sort of weary resignation, a shared sense of mild exasperation that seemed to permeate the office. Agnes, with her unwavering adherence to protocol and her almost militant approach to personal space, was, it seemed, a source of both admiration and, at times, quiet frustration. He found a series of emails from a junior marketing associate complaining about Agnes's insistence on alphabetizing the communal sugar packets. There was a Slack thread where Brenda from accounting had subtly chided Agnes for her unnecessary vocalizations during a particularly intense spreadsheet analysis. And then there was a series of increasingly desperate pleas from Kevin from marketing, asking Agnes if she could possibly loan him some of her fancy yogurt for a team-building exercise. Agnes's responses, always polite but firm, were textbook examples of her unwavering resolve. Miller leaned back, a new thought forming in his mind. What if Agnes's meticulousness, her very dedication to order, had inadvertently created a target? What if, in her pursuit of perfect artisanal yogurt, she had, in fact, made an enemy? The idea of a disgruntled employee, driven to desperate measures by the sheer, overwhelming perfection of Agnes Periwinkle, began to take root. It was a far more compelling narrative than a random act of theft. It was, in its own peculiar way, a story of office politics gone deliciously, or rather, tragically, awry. He decided to revisit the security footage, this time with a different perspective. He looked not for an overt act of larceny, but for subtle cues, for any deviation from the norm that might indicate a hidden agenda. He watched Agnes place the yogurt in the refrigerator, her movements precise, almost reverent. He watched the parade of colleagues pass by, their interactions mundane, their faces impassive. And then he saw it. A flicker, a momentary hesitation, a subtle shift in posture that he had previously overlooked. It was Brenda from accounting, returning to the refrigerator at 11:52 a.m., ostensibly to retrieve her salad. But for a fraction of a second, her gaze lingered on Agnes's yogurt, a look that was not one of casual observation, but of something far more complex. It was a fleeting expression, easily dismissed, but to Sergeant Miller, it was a crimson jewel in the otherwise bland landscape of the security footage. It was a clue. And Sergeant Miller, a man who appreciated the beauty of a well-ordered investigation, was now on the scent of a truly magnificent, and perhaps deeply personal, crime. Sergeant Miller, A man whose career had thus far been a predictable procession of pilfered stationery and misplaced access cards found himself in uncharted territory. The Sterling and Finch corporate universe, usually a placid expanse of quarterly reports and lukewarm coffee, had been thrown into a mild but persistent state of disarray by the disappearance of a single, artisanal yogurt. He'd interviewed Brenda from accounting, a woman whose primary concern seemed to be the precise calculation of her own lunch break, and Gary from IT, whose alibi involved an intricate explanation of a server reboot that Miller suspected was more fiction than fact. Kevin from marketing, bless his perpetually oblivious heart, had offered a rambling account of a particularly challenging spreadsheet that had occupied his entire morning. None of them had exhibited any overt signs of guilt, though Miller had learned long ago that guilt often wore a remarkably unassuming disguise. He returned to Agnes Periwinkle's desk, a gleaming monolith of organization amidst the mild chaos of the general office. Her workspace was a testament to her personality. Pens aligned with military precision, sticky notes adhered with geometric accuracy, and her inbox a landscape of pristine, unread emails. The stapler seemed to possess an almost regal stillness. Agnes, however, was not at her desk. She was standing by the communal refrigerator, her gaze fixed on the now empty space where her crimson jewel of a yogurt had once nestled. Her posture was rigid, her shoulders squared as if bracing for an unseen blow. Miller approached cautiously, the faint scent of Agnes's signature lavender hand cream preceding him. "Ms. Periwinkle," he began, his voice a low rumble designed to soothe rather than alarm. "I've conducted preliminary interviews with your colleagues." Agnes turned, her eyes, usually a placid shade of cornflower blue, now held a spark of something akin to righteous indignation. "And? What have they revealed, Sergeant?" Her tone was clipped, the syllables enunciated with a ferocity that suggested she expected nothing less than a full confession. Miller cleared his throat. "Well, Ms. Periwinkle, as you know, Mr. Kevin from marketing claims to have been engrossed in a spreadsheet. Mr. Gary from IT provided a rather detailed account of a server issue. And Ms. Brenda from accounting." He paused, recalling Brenda's evasive answers and the peculiar way she'd avoided direct eye contact when discussing the refrigerator's contents. Ms. Brenda seemed rather preoccupied with her own lunch arrangements. Agnes's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. "Preoccupied? Sergeant, that is hardly a definitive alibi. One can be preoccupied with many things, including, I dare say, the clandestine consumption of another's property." Miller nodded, appreciating the logic, however extreme, behind her assertion. Indeed. However, the security footage from the kitchen area, while comprehensive, does not show any individual directly removing your yogurt. There are numerous comings and goings, of course. People retrieving their own lunches, making coffee, that sort of thing. But no one is seen with your specific container. Agnes's lips thinned. Then the perpetrator must have been particularly cunning. Or perhaps they employed a method of extraction that bypassed the camera's purview. A diversion, perhaps? A carefully orchestrated distraction, during which the yogurt was spirited away? She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sergeant, I believe this may have been an inside job. Someone with intimate knowledge of our department's routines. Someone who knew precisely when I would be away from my post." Miller considered this. Sterling and Finch was a large corporation, but Agnes's department, data entry and auditing, was relatively small and insular. The idea of a coordinated effort, even for a single yogurt, seemed elaborate, yet he couldn't dismiss it entirely. Agnes's unwavering conviction was a powerful force, and her meticulous nature suggested she wouldn't have called security for a minor infraction. An inside job, Miller mused aloud, stroking his chin. That does narrow the field, in a way. But without direct evidence, it's difficult to pinpoint anyone. He glanced at the security logs he'd brought with him, a thick binder filled with timestamps and grainy stills. Let's review the footage again, Ms. Periwinkle. Perhaps we missed something subtle. You are, after all, an expert in identifying discrepancies. Agnes agreed, and they settled into a small, sterile conference room adjacent to the main office. The projector whirred to life, casting a flickering image onto the screen. They watched the comings and goings in the kitchen, a silent ballet of office workers performing their midday rituals. Miller, with his practiced eye, scanned the frames, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Agnes, with her almost preternatural attention to detail, watched with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. There, Agnes suddenly declared, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the screen. The image showed Brenda from accounting standing by the refrigerator, her hand hovering near the door handle for an unusually long moment. She wasn't opening it, just contemplating it. Look at her, Sergeant. The hesitation, the furtive glance over her shoulder. She's not merely deciding what to have for lunch. She's contemplating her next move. Miller zoomed in on Brenda's face. She did indeed look thoughtful. But was it the thoughtful contemplation of a yogurt thief, or simply the thoughtful contemplation of someone trying to avoid a second helping of questionable tuna salad? She appears to be looking around, Ms. Periwinkle, not directly at your yogurt. And she doesn't open the door. Precisely, Agnes exclaimed, her voice rising. She didn't open the door. This was before. She knew my yogurt was gone. She was surveying the landscape, assessing the situation. Perhaps she was even considering the best time to strike, or perhaps she was casing the joint for a future operation. And then, later, when she saw the empty space, she feigned surprise, didn't she? A masterful performance of innocence. Miller leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. Agnes Periwinkle was, without a doubt, the most dedicated, most imaginative complainant he had ever encountered. He could almost see the wheels turning in her mind, constructing an elaborate conspiracy theory around a missing dairy product. Ms. Periwinkle, he said, his voice gentle. While Ms. Brenda's behavior might seem suggestive to you, it doesn't constitute proof. The footage shows her looking around, yes, but it doesn't show her taking anything. And as I mentioned, no one is seen directly removing your yogurt. Agnes's shoulders slumped slightly, but her resolve did not waver. Then we must consider other possibilities. Was there a delivery? A new employee who might not be privy to the unwritten, yet fiercely enforced rules of office etiquette? A disgruntled former colleague seeking revenge? Miller sighed inwardly. He was beginning to suspect that Agnes Periwinkle's meticulously constructed composure had been irrevocably shattered by this culinary vandalism. He decided to try a different tack. Ms. Periwinkle, you mentioned your yogurt was artisanal. Can you describe it in more detail? The brand, the specific flavor, perhaps any unique packaging? Agnes's eyes lit up, her passion for her lost yogurt momentarily eclipsing her suspicion of her colleagues. Of course, Sergeant, it was a small batch, organic Greek yogurt, from a rather exclusive purveyor that only makes deliveries to select establishments. This particular batch was infused with wild raspberry essence, and the topping was a delicate crumble of toasted almonds and a hint of crystallized ginger. It was nestled in a clear, recyclable tub, approximately 6 ounces, with a minimalist label featuring a stylized depiction of a lyre. She paused, a wistful expression on her face. It was, in short, the crowning glory of my midday repast, a moment of unadulterated bliss in the relentless churn of the workday. Miller scribbled notes furiously. Organic, Greek, raspberry, almond, ginger, lyre logo, got it. He looked at the footage again, his gaze sweeping over the other individuals who had entered the kitchen. There was Gary from IT, his usual disheveled appearance offset by a surprisingly clean mug. There was Kevin from marketing, his face buried in his phone, a half-eaten packet of crisps clinging to his chin. And then there was Brenda again, this time at the coffee machine, her back to the refrigerator. "Ms. Periwinkle?" Miller said, pointing to a frame where Brenda was pouring her coffee. "This is approximately 10 minutes after the previous sighting of her near the refrigerator. Notice anything different?" Agnes squinted at the screen. Brenda was holding her coffee cup. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. "She appears to be drinking coffee, Sergeant, a rather mundane activity. Wouldn't you agree?" "Perhaps," Miller conceded. "But look at her left hand. She's holding a small white object. It appears to be a spoon, and if you look closely at the angle..." He zoomed in further, the pixels blurring the image, but a distinct shape began to emerge. "It looks remarkably like a small, disposable spoon, the kind one might use to eat yogurt." Agnes gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "A spoon, of course. The perpetrator would need a spoon." "And she is holding one, Sergeant! She is holding a spoon!" Miller felt a prickle of excitement. This was more than just Agnes's fervent belief. This was a tangible piece of circumstantial evidence. "It's still not definitive, Ms. Periwinkle. People use spoons for all sorts of things. Perhaps she was stirring her coffee, or eating something else." "But she wasn't eating anything else, was she?" Agnes countered, her voice regaining its earlier ferocity. "She had no other food items with her. And the timing. She was near the refrigerator, then she was seen with a spoon. It all fits, Sergeant. The pieces are falling into place." Miller nodded slowly. The pieces were indeed beginning to align, forming a picture that was both absurd and, to Agnes, undeniably damning. He decided to conduct a follow-up interview with Brenda, this time with a slightly more pointed line of questioning. He found Brenda at her desk, meticulously organizing a stack of invoices. The fluorescent hum of the office seemed to amplify the tension in the air. "Ms. Brenda," Miller began, standing beside her desk, "I need to ask you a few more questions regarding the incident in the kitchen this morning." Brenda looked up, her expression one of mild surprise. "Oh? Has anything new come up, Sergeant?" "We've been reviewing the security footage," Miller said, watching her closely. "And we noticed you near the refrigerator earlier today. And later, by the coffee machine, you were holding a spoon." Brenda's eyes flickered, a subtle shift in her placid demeanor. "Yes, I suppose I was. I was having my morning yogurt." Agnes, who had followed Miller, let out a small, choked sound. "Your morning yogurt?" Miller pressed gently. "What kind of yogurt was it, Miss Brenda?" Brenda hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Oh, just a regular one. From the convenience store down the street. Strawberry, I think." "Strawberry," Miller repeated, his gaze unwavering. "And was it in a clear, recyclable tub, with a minimalist label depicting a lyre?" Brenda's face drained of color, her carefully constructed composure, so unlike Agnes's but equally real, began to crumble. She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I don't remember the label. It was just yogurt." "Ms. Brenda," Agnes interjected, her voice ringing with the authority of a wronged party. "My yogurt was artisanal. It was organic. It had wild raspberry essence, toasted almonds, and crystallized ginger. It was a thing of beauty, Miss Brenda, a testament to culinary artistry. And you consumed it." Her voice cracked with emotion. Brenda's eyes welled up. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled, her gaze fixed on her hands. I was running late, and I saw it, and it looked so good, and I wasn't thinking. I thought it was mine. I must have grabbed it by mistake." I only realized when I tasted it, but then I was already at my desk and I didn't want to make a fuss. I was going to replace it, I promise." Agnes stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. The perpetrator, identified. The crime, so meticulously documented in her mind, had been solved, but the resolution was not the sweet victory she had envisioned. It was laced with the bitter taste of betrayal and a dawning realization that sometimes, even in the most ordered of worlds, mistakes, however egregious, were simply mistakes. Miller, ever the professional, penned a brief report. Perpetrator identified as Brenda from accounting. Motive: opportunistic hunger and mistaken identity. Yogurt: presumed consumed. Case closed. He knew, however, that for Agnes Periwinkle, the case might never truly be closed. The scar of the great yogurt heist would forever be etched into the pristine landscape of her workday. The fluorescent hum of Sterling and Finch's office kitchen, usually a comforting, mundane sound that underscored Agnes Periwinkle's unwavering routine, was now the soundtrack to an impending apocalypse. Her meticulously constructed composure, a fortress built over years of precise data entry and geometrically aligned sticky notes, had shattered like cheap porcelain. The crimson jewel of her midday repast, a small artisanal Greek yogurt with a swirl of artisanal raspberry topping, had vanished. Not merely misplaced, but gone. A gaping void that echoed with the hollowness of betrayal. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic, immediately began to process the evidence. The refrigerator, a gleaming monolith of stainless steel, now tainted with the memory of what should have been. The subtle discrepancies in its usual pristine state. A slightly askew carton of milk, a rogue pickle jar nudged askance. These were not the random acts of absent-mindedness of her colleagues. These were the telltale signs of a struggle, a desperate, clumsy grab for her sacred yogurt. The security footage, initially a beacon of hope, had proven to be a cruel mistress. No shadowy figures lurking, no furtive hands reaching. Just the mundane ebb and flow of office life, a blur of figures passing through, all seemingly engrossed in their own predictable routines. But Agnes, with her hawk-like attention to the subtlest discrepancies, had seen it. Brenda from accounting, hovering near the refrigerator with an uncharacteristic air of furtiveness, her eyes darting about with a nervous energy that screamed guilt. Brenda, whose own yogurt was a pale, decidedly unartisanal imitation, devoid of any fruit-based embellishment. The ensuing interview had been a masterclass in Agnes's quiet, yet formidable, interrogation techniques. Brenda, initially blustering with a feigned ignorance, had eventually crumbled under the weight of Agnes's unwavering gaze and the damning circumstantial evidence. The confession, when it came, was a pathetic whisper, a confession of a mistake, not a crime. A case of mistaken identity, she'd stammered, her voice thick with mortification. She'd grabbed the wrong tub, identical in size and placement, and in her haste had consumed it without a second thought. Agnes had listened, her expression impassive, her internal world a tempest. A mistake? A mere oversight? The thought was almost more offensive than outright theft. It implied a lack of care, a casual disregard for the meticulous order Agnes so fiercely guarded. Her yogurt was not just food, it was a symbol, a testament to her planning, her discernment, her dedication to quality. To have it consumed by mistake, carelessly, thoughtlessly, was an insult of the highest order. Yet here she was, the crisis seemingly averted. Brenda had offered a profuse apology, even promising to replace the offending yogurt with a dozen of Agnes's preferred brand. Gary from IT had offered a sympathetic, if slightly bewildered, nod. Even Kevin from marketing, usually perpetually oblivious, had managed a fleeting, "Bummer, Agnes." But for Agnes, the hollow ache remained. The betrayal, however unintentional, had left a scar. The sanctity of personal property, an unwritten yet fiercely enforced tenet of office etiquette, had been violated. The fabric of their shared professional ecosystem, a delicate tapestry woven with unspoken understandings and a mutual respect for individual boundaries, had been strained. The equilibrium had been disturbed. Agnes sat at her desk, a monument to organization, her pristine paperclips aligned with military precision, her inbox a landscape of unread emails awaiting her methodical attention. The incident, however resolved on the surface, had left her with a lingering unease. It was a reminder that even within the controlled environment of Sterling and Finch, chaos could, and did, intrude. She picked up her pen, the familiar weight a small comfort in her hand. Her gaze drifted to the communal refrigerator, its gleaming surface now a symbol of vulnerability. She had always believed in the power of institutions, in the logical course of action. She had reported the infraction, followed the established protocols, and the perpetrator had been identified. Justice, in its own small, office-bound way, had been served. But the experience had changed her. The incident, the great yogurt heist, as she privately, and with a grim sort of amusement termed it, had revealed a vulnerability she hadn't known she possessed. She had faced the abyss of disorder, and though she had emerged victorious, the memory of that terrifying emptiness, that gaping void, remained. Brenda, her face a mask of genuine remorse, stood before Agnes's desk, holding a small white paper bag. "Agnes," she began, her voice soft. I wanted to apologize again. And this is, well, it's not exactly artisanal, but I picked up a few of your favorites. The raspberry ones." She extended the bag, her hand trembling slightly. Agnes looked at the bag, then at Brenda's earnest, apologetic face. The fury that had simmered within her for the past hour began to recede, replaced by a weary understanding. Brenda's act had been one of genuine, albeit clumsy, error. There was no malice, no deliberate intent to disrupt Agnes's world. It was simply human error, a messy, inefficient emotion that Agnes had always abhorred. "Thank you, Brenda," Agnes said, her voice measured, devoid of its earlier sharp edges. She took the bag, the crinkle of the paper a soft sound in the otherwise quiet office. "I appreciate it." Brenda visibly relaxed, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. "I'm really sorry, Agnes. I promise. I'll be more careful from now on." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "And maybe you could tell Sergeant Miller that it was a mistake? I don't want this to go on my permanent record." Agnes considered this. Sergeant Miller, the burly, no-nonsense security guard, had taken the report with a mixture of weary resignation and mild amusement. He'd assured Agnes that such incidents were rare, but not unheard of. The idea of a formal reprimand for Brenda over a mistaken yogurt seemed disproportionate. "I will," Agnes said, a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It was a mistake, Brenda. We all make them." The words felt foreign on her tongue, a concession to the messy reality of human interaction. Brenda beamed, a genuine, relieved smile. "Thank you, Agnes. You're very understanding." She turned and walked away, her step lighter than before. Agnes watched her go, then turned her attention back to the paper bag. She opened it, revealing 3 small tubs of Greek yogurt, each adorned with a vibrant swirl of raspberry. They were, as Brenda had admitted, not artisanal. The branding was generic, the packaging utilitarian. But they were Here yogurt. Her chosen brand, her preferred flavor. She took one out, the cool plastic a familiar sensation in her hand. She unscrewed the lid, and the sweet, slightly tart aroma of raspberry filled the air. She raised the spoon to her lips. the creamy texture a welcome, if not entirely satisfying, sensation. It was good, certainly, but it lacked the subtle complexity, the nuanced perfection of her original yogurt. It was a substitute, a pale